This is the Real Coaching Podcast. I'm Joel Filliol, an international triathlon coach based in the UK and Spain. And my current project in coaching is my multinational elite squad based in Girona in Spain and primarily focused on Olympic pathway performances, World Championship Series, Olympic Games, and though we do have some athletes competing in different distances, and over the years we have achieved over 100 World Series podiums and 6 World Senior Elite titles. Previously, I worked in Triathlon Canada as the national senior coach up until the Beijing 2008 Games. I also worked with British Triathlon as head coach, the Italian Triathlon Federation as the Olympic Performance Director, and Triathlon Australia as a Podium Centre head coach and Olympic Programme head coach. Today, before jumping into the main topic, why real coaching? What is the origin of that? So that's the original back in 2015 podcast that I was doing, that I started with Coach Paulo Souza. And it was really, real coaching was a play on words, a play on the proliferation of online coaching that we saw at the time. So that was 2015. And really about online coaches without much experience, without skin in the game of performance development. And what we thought is real coaching is about the real lessons that you learn at the coal face of coaching, dealing with challenges and people and problems encountered that you gather with experience over time. So it's a bit of a fun name, but also really about the lessons learned, sharing those experiences, the good, bad, and the ugly of performance over time. So to support the podcast, make sure you're subscribed. Oh, the format in this season is all of these podcasts started as long form writing on Substack. So make sure you're subscribed to the Substack. And if you found value in any of these episodes or the writing, consider to become a paid subscriber and comment. And alternatively, or if you're interested in personal coaching, either one-to-one coaching for highly ambitious and experienced athletes, you can contact me. Also consulting for people that are looking for a program review, to dive deep into periodization or other topics to help solve problems and perform better. That's an option. Or coach mentorship for coaches that like a second set of eyes on what they're doing, or to review their programming or common challenges. That's also available. So you can visit my website at joelfilliol.com and submit a contact there, and we can take it from there. So the topic today was inspired by Jan Frodeno's new podcast called Going Mental, which is exploring the mental side of high-level sport and where the differences could be in athletes' performances, how they reflect and the mistakes they may have made, what they learned through their process. And Jan has also a newsletter that's connected to that. And it's really interesting for me. There's like a personal connection with the very first episode with Alistair Brownlee. So as I said before, when I worked with British Triathlon in 2009 and 10 and part of 11, I got to work with Al and Johnny and the other British athletes in my role as head coach. And so it's kind of had a personal angle to listening to Jan and Alistair reflect on their lessons learned, their careers, and having also coached athletes who competed against both in their prime, including, of course, Simon Whitfield competing against Jan and with Jan in the Beijing Olympics, where they were both medalists, and obviously Jan was the gold medalist. So there was a personal connection to listening to this one, and I really enjoy in general when athletes and coaches are able to reflect on the past and think about what they might have done differently, where they may have made mistakes. And as I've said before, when I reflect on a number of the mistakes that I've made in my career, and I think of how formational those have been on taking the next steps and applying those learnings to my coaching, I found that kind of reflection really valuable. And as I wrote in the article, of course, when I was listening to Jan and Alistair speaking, important to say that, much respect to both of them. What came to me as I was thinking about their conversation is not a criticism at all of what they were doing in their reflections, but instead inspiration from what they discussed together. So really it's about this topic is about the mental side of performance, the mental edge. And it's often the cliche that certain percentage of sport is mental more than necessarily the physical differences. Was the difference between champions and everyone else. And I think, of course, it's worth saying that the elite physical genetics are the table stakes for top performance. You can't fake it if you've not got the appropriate genetics. But then at the top level, the genetics, as it manifests itself in, VO2 max or other things that we can measure, are not really the differentiators. And then it does become very interesting to delve into the mental side of performance, both in competition and training, how they manage themselves, how they manage the environment around them, how they manage training, their process, and ultimately in better decision making on a daily basis. I think there's so many great athletes that have become undone by the decisions they've made, whether that be poor decision making or caught up in ego or other factors that derailed their progression in performance. So that's the thesis here. And I think that the first part of the conversation and my reflection on Alistair and observing him is the mental side in competition. And, I'm going to talk about training and competition as distinct areas in the mental space. But it's without a doubt that Alistair was one of the best ever triathletes in terms of his mental game, his mental side of his racing, the amount of confidence and assertiveness, his willingness to take risks. Of course, in that era of his best, there was tremendous investment in the swim to bike breakaways and being willing to both work very hard to get others to work very hard and create those differences on the bike. And either many of his competitors struggled to marshal others to help them and or to do the work themselves, but nobody could accuse Alistair of being a passenger at all. And that kind of racing with confidence and assertiveness, it's hard to coach. I think there's a certain amount of innateness, there's a certain amount of character that comes into that. As much as we can know that the best strategy is to race on the front foot in many cases, in particular in short course triathlon, you might say in long course, the calculations are a little different in terms of the risk of going too hard and blowing up, as we've seen, particularly in Kona over the years. But in short distance racing and middle distance racing, the willingness to take risk, to put your nose in the wind, and risk blowing up, risk that you might end up with a worse result as a result of an aggressive strategy. So, coaching confidence and coaching athletes to race in the front like that, it is difficult, and there's a certain amount of innateness, and that would be my theory with Alistair. So. I mean, often we see with athletes like Alistair that they've got the ability to put themselves in the right position in order to be successful. And I think when you know you can win, we start to see the behavior is different than those who have not yet demonstrated that to themselves, who have not proven to themselves. Once athletes open the door to winning, they start to do everything a little differently because they know they can impact the race and control the race to a degree. And there's a certain amount of you. Well, you can fake it till you make it a little bit. You can't fake genetic talent, but in terms of attitude and the way that athletes race, can be surprisingly effective. But of course, if you've not got the fitness and conditioning, then assertive strategies don't always work out. But it does make me reflect on a couple of memories of working around Alistair at the time when I was British Triathlon head coach, and I'd go up to visit Leeds on a weekly basis. Usually I was watching the track sessions, and in my second year there, so the first year was 2009 when Alistair won his first senior title, the first World Championship series that there was post Beijing. In that winter, 2009-10, Alistair picked up a stress fracture, and he was forced to missed the first races of the 2010 season, but he decided to line up in Madrid in June, first race of the year. But what struck me at the time is how little training he had been able to do running. So, of course, returning to run after a stress fracture. I mean, generally you may have 6 weeks off-loaded running. You're probably going to have at least another 6 to 12 weeks building back, running frequency, building up any muscles that have atrophied, and tendon and ligament strength. And of course, Alistair being Alistair, he was keen to get back out racing, and hadn't really done any run sessions like intensity yet. And but he wanted to start the season, and I think he was prepared to take a risk on the swim and bike, and saw what happened, see what happens on the run, and yet the performance in Madrid was absolutely dominant, and of course he drove the swim and bike, and yet still won on the run. And I recall reflecting at the time just how his mental strength and confidence had kind of made that result happen, because on paper he had no right to win, in the sense that his preparation didn't lead towards that kind of outcome, and yet he was able to impose himself on the field with his confidence and assertiveness, just to make the race happen how he needed to win. I mean, he didn't go in thinking, well, so see what happens, and maybe conserve some energy and just try to run my best. He really went into the race to try to win, knowing that he might blow up and he might just sort of crawl to the finish line instead of run how he did. But that approach to race with confidence and assertiveness was super impressive, and illustrative of Alistair's strengths that he brought to World Series Triathlon. And then the next memory that I had was the other side of that, was that strength was when in London that same year, where he basically pushed himself to the limit on the run. And for London, it was a relatively hot day, like sometimes you can get there, and he ended up basically blacking out and over the finish line, and he had gradually drifted back in the race to finish 10th, and basically collapsed over the finish, and he'd be taken to the hospital. He had ultimately had heat stroke, and but he says he doesn't remember really the end of that race. So he was really at the limit, and I suppose again that ability to push yourself to that limit and beyond. Sometimes it's not the best for overall health and well-being, but we saw that the other characteristic of being able to push himself was basically collapsing at the finish and needing to be hospitalized, as opposed to just stopping somewhere earlier in the run, which is what you'd expect most people to do when things have gone pear-shaped like that. And I remember the discussions afterwards about, okay, what should he do now? Because I think in some of those scenarios where athletes suffer from heat stroke or heat illness, you can get the body sort of having a reset of what the limits might be. And there was some doubt about whether Alistair would be able to push himself to the limit in the future in the same way. And, whether brain might self-protect in the future. So there was a strategy that was put in place to gradually build back up sort of tolerance to the heat and raise sort of the limit. But then it was, discussed, well, he's not going to really change his way of racing, isn't he? Nor would you want him to, because his success as an athlete and person has come from that ability to push himself, to take risks, and that, changing his approach as a result of that experience in London and the collapse with the heat probably wasn't desirable or even possible while maintaining his ability to perform at his best levels. So again, it's one of the principles of coaching that I've experienced over the years is, you kind of have to accept people for who they are. You can change some qualities and characteristics, but people bring an innate character and quality to the table that you're going to have to manage and deal with, and indeed many of the top athletes also have a significant dark side of some of those qualities that have to be managed in order to get the best out of them for their own performance, and so that they can avoid sort of the patterns of self-sabotage and self-destruction that we sometimes see. So that was some reflections on the mental side of competition. But then the other thing that I got thinking about when I was listening to the interview with Jan and Alistair was the training side of things, and both the experience both of them had with significant injuries over time, and there's a quote in this concept about the 99%, and so the quote from Alistair was, I would feel it's an aberration if I got to the Olympic start line at 95%. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to get there at 99.9%. And of course, if I go to 101%, that's part of the parcel, says Alistair. And then Jan replies, the difference between 99.9 and 101, that's not a podium position. That's a stress fracture, a torn muscle, an entire season gone. That's lying on a physio table wondering if you just ended your career chasing a fraction of a percentage point that doesn't actually exist. So I think there, Jan can see the conundrum. He can see the risk involved, and it also illustrates how Alistair saw things. He was trying to maximize the level of performance, and willing, at least theoretically, to take that risk as he reflects now. I think he felt he needed to be at 99% in order to win, and that's something that could be disputed perhaps, but that's how he was thinking about things. And looking at the big picture, you can sort of see that kind of mentality. Well, there's some positives to it. It can also lead to these injuries that can have such a huge cost on an athlete's career. And as Jan notes, chasing that extra percentage can end up in a catastrophe. If you can't compete, you can't win. And underperformance is the other side of things. It's not always about injury, but about smashing yourself in training to find that percent, and then not being able to perform how you want come competition time. And then Jan also reflects, does this percentage even exist? And how should we think about this percentage versus the potential for it all to end in tears? And I think he's right to reflect that. How do you even quantify what that means? The 95% versus 99%, like how, I think it's a mentality that if we zoom out and think about the big picture for many athletes, that mentality can be self-destructive if not managed carefully. So I talked a little bit about this in the general concept of chasing confidence and ego driving training behaviors in the Don't Be a January Champion article. And that's like avoiding the trap of pushing too hard and taking unnecessary risks. That this is critical to get right for athletes and coaches to achieve their best performances when it matters. So that is the wider theme there. Right load at the right time, and avoiding this concept of chasing confidence and ego that can drive self-sabotaging behaviors. And then, as I discussed there, the other part is just being overcooked come race day. And again, this is a very common theme that I talked about in the Championships Reflections article. That athletes, they arrive, they compete, and they say they felt flat in the race, which often can either come from doing too much in the lead up and then not having the time to absorb that work and recover before race day. Or they just weren't able to push as hard as they expected in the race, as they expected from training, which often to me indicates that they left their best performance was in training. And then, there's only so many times you can do sort of best performance and best efforts in a year, and then it's just not available when you really want it to be come race day. And all of these are underpinning this principle that the goal of arriving to major events is you've got to get there healthy and with an energy reserve to compete at your best, so that you can fully express your potential and what you've shown in training. And I would say the companion principle to that is even at the biggest stages, Olympic Games, World Championships, what's often required is not the best performance you've ever done, but instead being able to reproduce what you've done before, but under the additional stress and pressure that comes with a championship. So, of course, we do see sometimes best performances, but that's from the competition environment pushing athletes on. But the real requirement is to do what you've done before, to deliver under pressure what you have achieved before. And there are certainly some athletes who do have that peak performance at the games or championships. But if it's to generalize, what you need to do to perform your best is to deliver reliably and predictably under pressure. And again, underperformance is such a common problem, and it's important to understand and unpick why that's happening. And equally, the performance under pressure applies to the training process as well. So letting pressure get to you in training can manifest itself in taking too many risks and pushing the limits for too long, and then not being able to recover, absorb that. And again, we see that. Okay, is that actually what the 99% versus 100%, 101 or 99% looks like? Is pushing the red line between recovery, absorption, just surviving training rather than thriving, pushing that red line too long, and then what can result injury, pain, or being unable to do either the training required or even compete as a result of pushing that line. So that can show up in any number of ways in training. Not listening to your body when you have pain or niggles that persist, not communicating when you have niggles or pain because you're worried about being able to do less training. It can be not paying attention when fatigue gets too deep, when the RP of efforts starts to decouple from the performances, when you get your RPs too high. It can be when sleep and appetite is affected, not fueling enough in your efforts, or trying to change your body composition under high training load. The risks can look like doing one or more reps too many, going too fast or harder than necessary. Can be trying to prove yourself that you're ready to compete by progressing your training too quickly or doing too much too soon in the build. Could also look like pushing through when sick or ill, or indeed trying to come back to a higher training load too quickly following a setback. So those are all common things that we see that pushing and taking risks can manifest themselves. And when you look at a number of those, of course, they don't look wise. They look like mistakes, and yet they're very common. When we think we're trying to maximize our performance, we can fall into those traps. And I think the principle that injuries are not an inevitable part of the performance process. Of course, we do everything we can to avoid injuries. They can still happen despite the best intentions and best processes to support training, decision-making, recovery, nutrition, medical support. It can still happen despite every intention to avoid them. But they're not inevitable, and they shouldn't be viewed as a part of the process that can't be avoided. They can, and we should do everything we can to achieve that principle of getting to the start line healthy and ready to go. So the other point about injuries is not just about the short-term consequences. Of course, you're going to miss time training, maybe races, due to an injury, but the long-term consequences of injuries are also significant. The rehab, the rebuilding process, it takes time. A heuristic is however time you've had off, you got to double that roughly to get back to a normal training load. So if you've had 6 weeks off, you need another 12 weeks generally to get back to where you were. But you end up these secondary or tertiary effects that can result in repeating the pattern following layers of injuries. So you get compensation, accumulation of compensation, and this can accumulate over time. And when you see athletes, they've entered injury cycles. They often repeat slightly different versions of or secondary issues that can accumulate over time. So certainly we want to do everything we can to avoid those. And both Jan and Alistair acknowledged that a number of times they got these calculations wrong, and they were forced to sit on the sidelines in many cases for number of times in particularly the latter half of their careers. So then, we could make the case, listening to Jan and Alistair, that their remarkable successes could be attributed to the risk-taking approach that they knew and accepted that there could be potential fallout. That's a case that could be made, and indeed Alistair's in competition mental strength, as I said there, perhaps he wouldn't have been successful any other way. We just don't know. We don't know what alternatives could have been. Could Alistair have been a 3 or 4 time gold medalist if he had a different approach? But we just don't know. We can only know on what we saw and how he reflected on things and what we can learn from observing. But I think in a general sense, though, I've seen many times over the years athletes who have left a tremendous amount of performance on the table unachieved. It can be for all different reasons. Some out of their control, some in their control. Sometimes because of their decision making. Many of the best athletes, they've walked the line of amazing performances and self-sabotage and self-destruction. Some of those same characteristics that drive athletes, the relentless obsession of success, can have a dark side, and they may leave performances on the table unachieved as a result. So those character traits that allow them to be among the best or be the best can vacillate between broken and peak performance, either physically or mentally or even both. So finding that right formula is a big part of the game of top level performance, and it's certainly interesting to listen to and hear the experiences of those that have walked that line. Sometimes got it super right, and then sometimes it hasn't worked out. So there was a nice companion piece. I suspect it was inspired from this conversation. Um, from Non Stanford. So Non is British athlete, former world champion who trained in Leeds the same time as Alistair for part of her career, and is now coaching. She started coaching in the UK in Leeds, and now coaches in Australia. And she joined her partner Aaron Royal and Yella Heens in their podcast, the All In podcast, and she was reflecting on her own career progression and the challenges she experienced in the pursuit of her best performances. And it was a really nice companion and a piece to the Alan and Jan discussion. And as an aside, I think it's really interesting to me to listen to formerly coached athletes talk and reflect about their careers. In this case, all three of these athletes in this episode coached as part of the JFT crew squad, and it's interesting because as a coach, you don't really know what messages and lessons get fully absorbed by the athletes, and what might not. And that's because the role of the coach in a squad environment in particular, but also in general, is to take the decision-making fatigue off the shoulders of the athletes. They don't have to make all the decisions, and they don't. It's not practical or even desirable to go into the reasons why you might make all the decisions. It would be exhausting to think about everything, the whys and the hows for everything. Many athletes, they want to be coached, they want to be led, and they want that some of that decision making taken off their shoulders so that they can focus on performing and doing their best to recover and absorb their training. So it's interesting to reflect again, knowing that on this conversation. So Non talks about how, in the first part of her career, she followed a very similar philosophy to what Al and Jan discuss, and how, she was trying to push towards the 99.9% of performance optimization, and how, in her view, that led to significant injuries and at times underperformances in the first stages of her career. And Non achieved some remarkable performances. Again, being 2013, she was the world champion, but she also described the cost of this approach for her and many of the athletes around her that she observed that were in a similar way of working and thinking. And she makes an interesting observation that she talks about how she went from tolerating the high volume and overall load towards physical breakdowns, multiple injuries, and dealing with the mental fallout as well. And particularly when she went into the Rio Olympic Games in 2016, in her view, overtrained and overcooked, and yet she came so close to a medal with fourth place, and was left wondering what could have been. And I think it's interesting how, again, thinking big picture, there are moments when athletes can do, extremely high volumes and workloads, and everything seems to be working well, and it's working until it stops working, and it's working until the injuries or illness or breakdowns start. And it can be an example of, in the moment, you think you can do it, you're pushing the limit, you're trying to get everything out of yourself. And then the next moment, everything stops and everything can fall apart, or everything can become more difficult. And you can pull yourself out of that, but it's, when you sort of think, look, what can we do in an optimal space is to zoom out and have the perspective to try not to fall into that space where breakdowns, injuries, mental burnout can set in. It takes a great wisdom in order to try to avoid that experience, and yet it happens, and it happens to the best. And Nan, in this episode, reflects on her experiences around that. And fourth place is a tough one. On one hand, brilliant performance. On the other hand, as she reflected, so close yet so far to that elusive medalist. And as an aside, I work with a number of Olympic fourth place finishers, 5 in total. I wasn't coaching them all at the time that they finished fourth. I think 2 of the 5, but the other 3. I did witness the aftermath of that and the struggles that each of them had mentally, where there was a commonality there, that it's a tough place to finish. So Non goes on to reflect on as she moved into coaching and how she now is integrating her own career lessons, what she's observed others doing, but now guiding and coaching others. And I think certainly for every former athlete, they reflect on their own experiences and hopefully what they got wrong, but also what they got right, and taking those experiences into helping others avoid the same mistakes. And I think Non reflects here that she believes, you should reject the 99% versus 100% or 101% framework due to the risks involved, and that, again, from what she experienced, and instead focus on being consistent at 95% instead of gambling on the 99%, reaching the full optimization. And of course, these are, again, they are not precise metrics we're talking about, but more a mindset, a framework. 95% means to me that you're doing the basics really well, you're getting the most out of your training, but you're not riding the red line of risks. And, you've left a buffer and you've created space to when things go wrong, that doesn't push you over the edge. And I think that, that's another principle that I often see in coaching is, things will go wrong. There will be, overreaching. There will be, tissues that are on the limit that will need a bit of space to recover, and catching those in the moment, making good decisions, you can bring it back from the edge. But if you're already on the edge and you get pushed over, that's when things turn into long-term injury or illness, or burnout. So I think the interesting part of, as Non's moved into coaching is that responsibility of now coaching really puts into focus the need to transform experiences, both yours and others, into effective decision making. And certainly her reflections show that, her approach, that top performance doesn't have to be all or nothing, despite the podcast that she's on, All In. But there are other philosophies, including a slightly less risky approach that may be more wise in the big picture for most people. So the conversation overall, I thought was both conversations was really interesting, and different reflections on their experiences. As the subheading of Jan's podcast is, why smart people make stupid decisions, I suppose is an insight into what he and perhaps Alistair think were at times stupid decisions, but of course there's no calculator or precision in that process, and again, it's so easy to fall into the trap of chasing confidence and letting ego drive decision making. And for most athletes, pushing too hard and taking risk in training is not the right approach. There might be contexts where it's worth it, but in general, for most athletes, the 99.9% of athletes that are out there, the cost of getting it wrong, this calculation wrong, are just too high. And again, that the top performances don't demand or require a perfect process. Most athletes, in my view, don't even arrive on race day having done the 95%, never mind the 99.9% line. So I think having a buffer in your training load, meaning space for things to go wrong, space to correct without it being over the edge and dipping into more significant problems, is a good strategy. It's not always easy to find out what the limits are. But I think the general principle, the heuristic of finish your training session with one rep left in the bank that you didn't use, is a wise one, and that can also extend to the bigger picture in weeks and months. So this principle again is creating space in your planning to perform at your best when it matters most. So yeah, I'm thankful for Jan and Alistair for sharing their experiences, and Non as well, and I think very useful reflections and perspectives. And of course, we can dig deeper into the practicalities of how we might apply the principle, but this big picture principle of creating space is useful, and leaving one rep in the bank. So thanks for listening. Make sure you're subscribed. Go over to Substack and subscribe there if you're not already. If you're interested in personal coaching or consulting or a second set of eyes on your own coaching, get in contact, and see you next time.